Genesis chapter 11, we're going to start reading. In verse 1 it says, "And the whole earth was of one language and of one speech, and it came to pass as they journeyed from the east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. And they said one to another, Go to, let us make brick and burn them thoroughly, that they may..." And they had brick for stone, and slime had they for mortar. And they said, Go to, let us build us a city and a tower, whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which the children of men builded. And the Lord said, Behold, the people is one, and they have all one language, and this they begin to do, and now nothing will be restrained from them, which they have imagined to do. Go to, let us go down, and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all the earth, and they left off to building the city. Therefore is the name of it called Babel, because the Lord did there confound the language of all the earth, and from thence did the Lord scatter them abroad upon the face of all the earth. Let's go ahead and have a word of prayer. Lord, I want to pray that you will bless this evening, a time that we can have in your word tonight. Lord, I pray that you will help me this evening, Lord. Help my weaknesses, my inabilities not get in the way of what you have for us tonight. Lord, I pray that you'll speak through me and use me tonight. Lord, I pray this in your name. Amen. You can go ahead and be seated. Brother Jance, I don't remember. Did I turn my mic on or not? Yes, I did. Okay. All right, so tonight I want to try to view this message in our series a little bit differently. Looking at this idea of you have a choice. This topic, and I'll tell you what it is in just a moment, but this topic will come up or at least be mentioned a lot throughout this series. As I've kind of been studying ahead in the series and trying to lay out the series a little bit, I think this is going to come up a lot, and it's very possible that there's going to be other messages that'll be on the same theme, but maybe from a different point of view. Tonight, what I want us to look at specifically is the choice between your way and God's way. And I believe to start, we need to kind of set the groundwork for the fact that those two things are not the same. I think that everyone in here we would all readily admit that my way and God's way are not always the same thing. But I don't know that we practice and live that. We say it, I don't know that we practice and live it. God's way is not the same as my way. We could view all sorts of examples that would demonstrate that. Last week we looked at Noah. Do you think that the flood and the ark was at all what Noah wanted? No. We know that Noah was the only one who found grace in the eyes of the Lord, and we know that everyone else was wicked, and I know that we looked at all of that last week. But wicked and evil or not, do you really think Noah's way to deal with that, or Noah's will, was for them all to be destroyed? I doubt it. Remember, those wicked and evil men that God destroyed in the flood, those were his family. Those would have been his friends. Those would have been his loved ones. They were living wrong, and they were in sin, no doubt, but that doesn't change the fact that they were people that he loved. I can assure you that it wasn't Noah's his will or his way for his loved ones to be destroyed. But God's will and mine aren't the same. We could look at it, the example of a man like David. David, who was, as far as we know, happy to just serve his dad and tend to the sheep. Nowhere do we see David as discontent with what he was doing with his life. Nowhere when the prophet came do we see David pushing to be in front of his brothers. Oh, I want to be the one that's anointed. Even when he's sent to the battlefield to see his brothers, and his brothers accuse him of, you're just here to see the fight. His brothers accuse that, but we don't biblically see that he went because he wished he was fighting the battle alongside him. As far as we know, David's will wasn't to go fight the giant. David didn't show up there and volunteer to go down and fight Goliath because it seemed like a fun thing to do. He didn't go and volunteer to fight Goliath because it was his way, his plan. He did it because God led him to. You move further down down David's life before he's king, and he is the anointed future king. You think about this, and I don't know that we look at this often. David shows a lot of humility and grace as the anointed king, or anointed future king, that he doesn't push things. He just faithfully serves Saul. Fights for him. We know he plays his harp for him, and yet Saul then goes into a rage and tries to kill him over and over and spends years chasing David and his men around the countryside. Do you think for a moment that was David's will? No. No, nature would be that when you're told, hey, you're going to be the next king, the natural instinct is, well, then I want to step up right now. I don't want to have to serve the guy who's currently king until it's mine. No, that's not our way. You certainly don't want to have to spend years of your life running from the guy who you'll soon be replacing. I can assure you this wasn't David's will. This wasn't David's way, but God's will and yours are not the same. You look at a man like Moses. Moses, after being rescued by his parents from being killed like he was supposed to as a baby, and then put in a basket where he's rescued by the Pharaoh's daughter, and then raised in the Pharaoh's home by his mom, and then flees to the wilderness, but in that wilderness meets his wife, has a family, and the Bible makes it pretty clear Moses was happy to live out his days tending to his animals, watching his kids grow up in the wilderness. He was happy with that, but God had other plans for Moses. Again, I can assure you, Moses' plan for his life was never to go back to Egypt. He had no idea what was waiting for him there. Remember, when he left, he had both his people and the Egyptians mad at him. He had no desire to go back there. But God wanted to use him and did use him in a mighty way, because God's way and my way are not the same. And we could look at so many other Old Testament examples. Gideon, who was in hiding, and God's way was different. Jonah, who was happy to let the people of Nineveh burn, but God's way was different. And on we could go. Skip to the New Testament, an example like Jesus himself, 100% God, 100% man. And that man side had a will of his own. So that when Jesus was in the garden, he prayed, not my will, but thine. Because given his will, his way, he probably wouldn't have gone to the cross. Given his will, he wouldn't have faced a mock trial. Given his will, he wouldn't have had his beard ripped out or a crown of thorns smashed on his head. Given his way, he probably wouldn't have had to have been beaten with a whip or nailed to the cross or a spear in his side. You can't tell me that 100% man's side wanted any of that. But he recognized God's way wasn't the same as his way. What about a man like Paul? Paul's way and God's way couldn't have been any more different. Paul's way for his life was chasing down the Christian. Paul's way for his life was causing havoc in the church. Paul's way for his life was threatenings and slaughter. He was on track for a whole lot of bad things. But God's way for Paul, on the other hand, was to take the gospel to areas that had never before been reached. God's way for Paul was to travel to the known world and face all sorts of dangers and opposition, all in the name of Christ. God's way for Paul was to stand up against those who threatened the Christian and give them the gospel. It could not have been any different than what Paul had for himself, but God's way is not the same as my way. And you think about it, that is just a drop in the bucket of biblical examples, and we could look at a whole lot more, but just helping us see that God's way and mine and yours are not the same. You could look at more recent men, and I say more recent than the Bible, not super recent, but thought of, as I was studying for this, I thought of a man like Billy Sunday. Billy Sunday, his way was to play baseball and be famous for his talent, for his skills, for his bat and his glove, and he had made that way. I looked it up while I was studying for this message. He had an 8-year professional baseball career. That's not a short career, and that's despite him quitting early when God got a hold of him. But that was his way. Nowhere along his way, as he's planning his life and headed into professional sports, nowhere along his way did he think, hey, at some point in mid-career, I'm going to give it all up and go be a preacher. But God's way isn't the same as my way. Men like Jim Elliot, missionary who wanted I just lost the name of the tribe, but wanted to reach a tribe of Indians, and I can assure you that his way was not that he would be killed by the very people he was trying to reach. But God's way was not his way, and might I add, God used it in a mighty way. And again, we could go on and on. I thought about it. I could list missionary after missionary and preachers and evangelists who all had their way, and in their minds they had their life planned out. But God's way was different. And why do I give all that? What's the point? I think it's big for us to see and understand that simple fact, that my way and God's way are not the same. Because while I think that every one of us in here, or every one of us that may be listening online, we would say we understand that, we struggle with it. And I think the place that can easiest be seen, or the easiest that can be seen, is in our prayer life, where rather than seeking God's will and direction and leading, very often our prayer life is seeking Him to give us ours. Rather than our prayer life being, God, I want your will, I want your way, I want your direction, it's instead, God, I want you to give me my way. We're asking God to give me my way rather than to lead me in His way. Now, like I said, I use all that tonight to really kind of set the groundwork here, helping us to really grasp that idea. God's way and my way are not the same, and we have a choice. We have a choice. Am I going to do it my way, or am I going to do it God's way? The passage that we started with tonight, Genesis chapter 11, is an interesting one. This is not long after the time of Noah. We're not very far removed from when the world was wicked and evil and destroyed by God. We're not very far removed from when Noah and his family are placed in the ark and go through the flood. We're not that far removed from when they come off the ark and are commanded to start over. Chapter 10 just finished the list of families of the sons of Noah. So we're not very far out of that, and immediately these people are left with the decision, my way or God's way. And they choose self. They choose self. I find it interesting, and maybe this is just me, they choose self knowing what it would mean. Look at verse 4 with me again. Verse 4, so this is before they actually start building. And they said, go to, let us build us a city and a tower whose top may reach unto heaven. This next part, and let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. Why would they think they're going to be scattered upon the face of the earth unless they knew what they were doing was wrong? Here's what's happening. They recognized there's a heaven. They recognized they wanted to be there. No doubt, when you're descendants of Noah, you've heard a little bit about what God can do. I have to think that Noah and his sons told their kids about the way God spoke to Noah. And I have to think that Noah and his sons told their kids and their grandkids about the ark that Noah had made and how the animals all just showed up, that God brought them there. And I have to think they told their kids and grandkids about the way the door of the ark closed and the rain and the amazing power of God. I have to think they told their kids and grandkids about the way that God saved them. If you have something that amazing happen in your life, that's a story you're going to pass down to the next generations. I mean, if you have things like that happen, you're just going to. My grandpa Ferris has been on my mind a lot lately. My wife and I, I'm not sure why, but we've been talking quite a bit about him lately, and it's just been on my mind. My grandpa had some amazing stories. I have no idea how many of them were true or how many of them were fabricated or embellished for effect. I don't know, but it really didn't matter. My grandpa had some great stories, and my grandpa loved to tell them. When I was a little kid, he'd come over and visit, and he used to call me his Laplander because he would come and I would sit on his lap and he would just start telling stories. If you have something as amazing as Noah, I have to think he had some grandkid Laplanders that he was like, let me tell you about the flood. And go into his story. These people knew about God. They knew who he was, and they knew he was in heaven, and they knew they wanted to be there. God's way had been laid out all the way back at Adam and Eve. When Adam and Eve sinned, God laid out his way that his son would come to take that sin, or take man's sin on himself. But God's way wasn't good enough. Perhaps for multiple reasons. Maybe, and this is speculating a little bit, I understand that, but follow me here. Maybe God's way just wasn't fast enough. That's something that many of us struggle with, that we understand that God has a way, and that we should follow that way. But I want it now. I want it now. God's way, is in God's time, and that might not be the same as mine. And we're impatient. And I understand. I know I'm guilty of it. My kids laugh at me about this. I get impatient at inanimate objects, stoplights. I hate them. This one out here is evil. I thought it was funny. I typed this out today, and then it did it to me today. So I have timed it today. That stoplight took me 4 minutes to get a U-turn. 4 minutes, which wouldn't be bad. But in 4 minutes, I know I'm not the only one. I appreciate that, Brother Roscoe. In 4 minutes, there were countless times that there were no cars coming from any direction. There's no reason, other than a camera there's no reason I couldn't have done a U-turn. Multiple times in those 4 minutes that the turn lane across from me got a green light. They got to go to El Toro, but I don't get to go home. Multiple times in those 4 minutes that there's no reason why I couldn't. It's infuriating. I can feel my blood pressure rising just talking about it. We're impatient. We're impatient. So we get the idea that God's way isn't happening fast enough, so I have to force my way. That's what's happening here. God had a way, just not in their time. Or perhaps it was that God's way required dependence. For God's way to work, for them to get to heaven, it required relying on God. People don't like that. People don't like to have to rely on someone else. They want to be self-made. They want to be independent and strong on their own. They want to think that they don't need anyone, which is a load of malarkey. I'll never forget, Dr. Pepper used to, I don't remember, it was years ago now, but they used to run a commercial that was built around being independent and one of a kind. And the old commercial, whoever came up with it just didn't think this whole process through. The old commercial, there were thousands of people wearing exactly the same shirt that says, I am one of a kind. Just like everyone else. I mean, I watched the commercial today to make sure I remembered it right, and it really is. It's a bunch of people running out of their work, pulling off their shirt, and their undershirt says, I am one of a kind. But we're all exactly alike. But we want to think that way. We want to think, I'm independent, I'm unique, I don't need anyone. So we struggle with the idea, well, that God's way requires I depend on Him. for whatever the reason, they chose their way to attempt to get to heaven over God's. It hasn't changed much. Today, people do the same. They choose religion over God's way, confusing that God and religion are not the same thing. Thinking that if they can find and follow the right religious patterns, they can get to heaven. But God's way is not religion. God's way is believing on His Son. Some choose works over God's way. That's what's happening in this passage. You think about it, if you're going to build a tower to heaven, they're going to put work into building that tower so that they can get their way to heaven. This is going to require some major work. Building a tower isn't easy. It takes planning. It takes lots of manual labor, especially, again, if you're talking a tower tall enough to reach the heavens. This isn't going to be easy. And don't forget, they didn't have cranes and machines and power tools. You're talking this is all done by hand. This is a lot of effort and work that they're putting into this. But their work would have never been enough. Now, there are people today that put in a lot of work into trying to get to heaven. That God's way isn't good enough for them. It's not what they want to do. They don't want to have to depend on Him, and they don't want to have to do it His way. It seems too simple, or it seems whatever. So they think, well, if I just work really hard and live really good, maybe it'll be good enough. Maybe through their works they can build their own tower to heaven, but their works are never enough. Just like the tower would have never reached. And I want to propose a thought to you this evening. I kind of mentioned it earlier on. They knew that it wouldn't work before they chose it. They recognized God was going to scatter them. They knew they'd be scattered before the tower was even started. They brought up the fact that we need to pick a name so that when God scatters us, we remember this happened. They knew it was never going to reach heaven. They knew they were going to be unsuccessful. Their goal, build a tower to reach the heavens, and they knew it's not going to happen. It's not going to work. And I want to propose this thought that people trying to work their way to heaven, I think, know the same thing when they make that choice. That's why whenever you ask anyone who is living off a works-based salvation, they'll tell you, at best, I hope so. I think so. I hope that they hope that what they do is enough good that when they get to heaven, it'll outweigh their bad. But I've never met one that's confident in that. It's always, I'm just hoping I do enough. But every individual has to choose my way or God's. They had to choose number 2, my way or God's, when it came to their name. Verse 4, we looked at. I'll go ahead and read it again. The last part of that, let us make a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. Now, give me a little bit of liberty here, but follow me on this. These people, they were God's creation. They had a name, but they wanted their own. The name that God made for them, the name that God planned for them, wasn't enough. They wanted to make a name for themselves. They wanted to be known for what they had done, not what God had done. To this point, everyone was known by what God had done, known by creation, known by the flood. These people wanted to be known for their creation, for their accomplishment, for their tower that they had built. They wanted to make a name for themselves, be known for what they had done, not what God had. There are a lot of people that struggle with that exact same thing, that God's given them a name, child of God. But they want to make a name for themselves, so they seek to be noticed. For some, they seek that in the world. They look for some career or some way that they can achieve a name for themselves. I'm convinced that that's why TV shows that people are trying to show off their talents are so popular. A lot of it is to watch people fail, because not everyone that thinks they're talented are. But for the contestants, many times it's about opportunity for a nobody to make a name for themselves. They're seeking fame. They're seeking to make a name. Some even seek a name in ministry. Maybe someone that they know they're called to pastor, or they know they're called to ministry, but they want some high-profile ministry. They want to pastor a big church where everyone's going to hear about them. They want to be in a ministry that's huge and growing, so that people are going to talk about them. They're building a name, and because of that, so often you'll see men leave a church that God's called them to, because in their mind some better offer came along that's going to build their name. But I think before we get too hard on pastors, many will do that inside a church. That they don't just want any ministry, they want the ministry they want because it'll give them a name. They don't want the ministry and the name that God gave them or that the church needs, because they want to choose their name. It's what's happening here in this passage. They chose their own way. They chose or tried to choose their way to heaven. They chose their own name. And then the last thing I want us to see this evening, they chose their own judgment. Let's go ahead and read verses 1 through 9 again. The whole earth was of one language and of one speech, and it came to pass as they journeyed from the east that they found a plain in the land of Shinar, and they dwelt there. And they said one to another, "Go to, let us make brick and burn them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone, and slime had they for mortar. And they said, "Go to, let us build us a tower, a city, and a tower whose top may reach unto heaven. And let us make us a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth." And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower which the children of men builded. And the Lord said, "Behold, the people is one, and they have all one language. And this they begin to do, and now nothing will be restrained from them which they have imagined to do. Go to, let us go down, and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech." So the Lord scattered them abroad from thence upon the face of all the earth, and they left off to build the city. Therefore is the name of it called Babel, because the Lord did there confound the language of all the earth, and from thence did the Lord scatter them abroad upon the face of all the earth. I've said this over and over, and I've done this on purpose. They knew what the result of this would be before they even began. Before they laid the first brick, they knew that God was going to see this, and they knew it was against His will. Before they even began, they had just found the plane and made a plan, and they knew this is going to be a problem, and they chose their own way anyway. What I find interesting, they chose this even though they knew what their judgment would be. Before they began, they knew what God was going to do. I have to wonder, just because of a biblical pattern we see, I have to wonder if God had warned them. Very often in the Bible, before God sends judgment, He sends a warning. If maybe God spoke to someone who preached to them, I don't know, but they obviously knew the judgment that would come. It didn't come as a shock to them. They knew that if we do this our way, God's going to come and He will scatter us. And they did it anyways, knowing the judgment. Knowing it would cost, they did it anyway. And a couple of quick points I want to make on this. Anytime you choose your way instead of God's, it costs. And it might even be better to say every time you choose your way instead of God, it costs. It may not cost you in the way you think, but it costs. It might be that you don't see the costs, but it costs. I've seen, I don't know the right way to say this. I've seen way too many people that I've known, kids that I've known, who are a mess spiritually because their parents chose their own way rather than God's. And I think very often it's this, that you, it might be that you don't feel the pain of choosing your own way, but that someone you love does. Because every time you choose your way over God's, it costs. Every time you choose your way over God's, it hinders your walk. Verse 9, I'm not going to have us read it again. We just did, but this happens and they're scattered. They made this choice, God judged, and they are scattered upon the face of the earth. Their walk with God, their relationship with God had been hurt because they chose their own way. And that may not seem like a big deal to some, but it is. I mean, this is your God, your Creator, your Heavenly Father, your Savior, your, whatever other title you want to put in there. And every time that you choose your way rather than His, you're putting a wedge between you and Him. You choose your way, there's a cost. There's judgment, and your walk is hindered. I want to try and wrap this together this evening. I've stressed in this series the choices that we have and that we face every day. And I've tried to do that as we go throughout this. This choice that we focus on tonight is a choice that every one of us has to make. And more than that, it's a choice that every one of us has to make on a daily basis, many times a day. God's way or my way? God's way or my way? And I know tonight that we looked at some specific areas in this passage that they chose their way rather than God's, but I don't want to limit it to that for us tonight, because the choice between God's way and mine covers every aspect of our life. That decision of, am I going to do this my way or am I going to follow God's, is a question that comes up in every area of your life. So I want to bring the message down to this tonight, and I'll bring it to this for our close. When presented with the choice of, do I do it God's way or mine, choose God's. I know that seems maybe oversimplified, but every time, choose God's. Probably in this series, I'm going to quote this verse a lot to you, Isaiah 55:9. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways. Let's recognize that God's way is higher than yours and choose His way. Let's pray. Lord, I pray that you'll help us to grasp this, Lord, this people that chose their way rather than yours. And it is a decision that we have to make, as I said, every day, multiple times a day. Every aspect of our life that we face and that we deal with, we are faced with that decision of, am I going to do this my way, how I want, or am I going to do this God's way? Lord, help us to see the importance of choosing your way. Help us to recognize that your way is right, that your way is higher, whether it's what makes sense to us or not. And every time, choose your way. I pray this in your name. Amen.
And as the men begin to sing an invitation song, we just want to extend to you an invitation to meet with your Lord at an altar.